Thank you so much, Jack, for taking the time and coming on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I was fortunate to catch up with you a few weeks ago on some other stuff, but definitely wanted to get you on the podcast and talk about all these things you've been doing. You kind of blew up on TikTok. Now you've built a significant following on Twitter as well, and you're talking about space, talking about hard tech, and just taking a really fresh and interesting approach to creating content about a very positive, I think, narrative around technology, which is obviously very similar to what I'm doing, just with more so like the podcast and writing and things like that. So a natural conversation to have, I think, and looking forward to digging in on some things for people who aren't so familiar with who you are and what you're doing. I think the best place to get started would just be to have you tell your story a little bit from as early as you're willing to really start to kind of where you are now.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on, Jake. I really appreciate it. This is, yeah, so how I got started in TikTok is, I used to make YouTube videos. My friends, they quit their jobs at one point and started not necessarily a startup, but just a company. And I started making vlogs. Like I was trying to imitate David Dobrik and his comedy vlogs and transfer that into startup vlogs. And so that was fun, but it was, pretty hard to grow on YouTube. Distribution's pretty tough, and TikTok was kind of popping off at the time. So I studied chemical engineering, and I had, previously worked at the Gigafactory. Then I started my own startup, and then I joined a YC startup as an early engineer working on their manufacturing and supply chain. And so I was doing that during my day, and then during my nights, I was just started making content with this idea to be a creator that invests in startups. And so I had made a few TikToks, and then one of my earliest TikToks went relatively viral at the time. It got 200,000 views, and it was a recap of Elon Musk presenting the Starship architecture. And so I was like, okay, there's clearly a niche here on TikTok to be a space guy with space videos. And so I kind of doubled down on that. I made like 5 videos of just the Starship architecture after that. And then I started transferring into other space startups, so like Rocket Lab, and then lesser known space startups. And then I started just doing general like hard tech startups. And now I would say that I just kind of make TikToks and YouTube videos, and now podcasts about hard tech startups building a more optimistic future.
Yeah, it's really an awesome set of content. Definitely, we'll give the links at the end of the show, and I encourage people to go consume the TikToks. It's easy to go down a rabbit hole and get lost, as I did yesterday and times before that as well. It's just like everything's bite size, and you actually get like a tremendous amount of information across very quickly. Um, I've sort of had this experience previously. Like I'm not on TikTok, and I'm not really too familiar with a lot of the majority of the content that goes on there. But I had Isabel Bomecki on the show previously. She's like a
Hmm.
nuclear energy
Yeah,
influencer.
we're friends. She's cool.
Yeah, yeah, she's great. And that was my first introduction to like, okay, a minute long TikTok video, you can actually learn like a good amount. And so the same definitely holds true. Um,
People underestimate how much you can compress in 60 seconds. Like there is so much wasted time in YouTube videos, especially just by YouTube trying to make the videos, promoting videos that are longer than 10 minutes, just because you can put 2 ads in there. People end up wasting a lot of time. And so it feels like it's necessary, but I think you can really compress a lot of information, as demonstrated in 60 seconds for sure.
Yeah, so let me ask, how did you like first get into space and hard tech more generally? I know you mentioned like the chemical engineering background and working at Tesla Gigafactory, but was this like a childhood thing or just something you sort of developed over time and interest in these sort of categories?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I grew up in Houston near the NASA Space Center. So I was surrounded by a few of my neighbors were astronauts. I was surrounded by NASA engineers. So I've definitely been exposed to space ever since childhood for sure. But I would say like the big time where I really got kind of obsessed with space was I was playing soccer, and I ended up spraining my ankle and breaking my foot, and I was kind of bedridden for a few days. And one of those days, I just consumed The Martian. And living on Mars, like it really felt like I was living on Mars. And I kind of just became obsessed with that. I started getting into in situ resource utilization and all these techniques for processing Martian regolith. And I read a lot of NASA papers, and I ended up making processing the Martian soil part of my final grad project in chemical engineering. So, like I can get into the details of that project, but I would say that was definitely the start of my interest in my more mature interest in space.
So like yeah, I mean, we don't need to go like too deep in the details if it's not, if you don't think it's that interesting, but I'm curious, like, I don't even know what that means. Like processing Martian soil, you said for your senior project, like what is
For
that?
sure. Yeah, so and technically it's Martian regolith, but soil it's just dirt essentially. And what I was working on was developing so Martian regolith has perchlorates in the soil, which is ClO4, so chlorine and four oxygen atoms. And what you can actually do is you can take this enzyme and design bacteria. You can just use some synthetic biology, and you can actually reduce the perchlorate into free Cl, which then can attach to something else, and then create two oxygen O2 molecules. And so what this means is that you can actually put this bacteria solution in dirt and then create breathable oxygen from it. So I kind of became obsessed with like, okay, it takes maybe I don't know, like a 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot box of dirt, and then you can actually breathe for a few hours if you had this dirt and you were like stranded somewhere on Mars. So, and then also like just producing more oxygen for the colony in general.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd say like half of that made sense to me, and the other half I'll have to go back and listen again. But I get the point of it. It sounds like just to like make oxygen and make otherwise unlivable habitats potentially
Yeah,
more
it was just
livable.
using what really interested me about it was it was using biological methods to create the oxygen. And so what was interesting about that is that you won't run out of the bacteria to continue creating the oxygen. So you can have like a growth rate of the bacteria, hopefully, and you have these raw inputs create the bacteria, and then it creates the oxygen once you mix it with the soil. And the perchlorates are also damaging to humans. So if you grow plants that absorb these perchlorates, it will, and you eat these plants or vegetables or whatever, it will actually impact your thyroid gland and be pretty damaging to humans. So this is a huge thing that we need to get rid of in the dust and the regolith of Mars.
Hmm, that's interesting. So, I mean, it's obvious that you had a lot of pent up knowledge, even just like when you were graduating and in school, and then ultimately, it sounds like you kind of started dabbling in some of this content creation and decided to go full time more recently. Can you talk
Mhm.
about like I've faced like somewhat of a similar situation myself, maybe, but I'm curious to hear what your considerations were and like what finally convinced you to sort of take the leap on going full time with Nasjaq.
Yeah, I think it was well, for one, I would never know what full-time Nasdaq would have been if I had never done it. So it was kind of just the curiosity of needing to understand what would happen and what will happen. But then two, it was just I had started making money from actually making content. I had signed a few brand deals, and I was like, okay, I have enough runway. This essentially, these brand deals give me maybe a few months of standard income, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna take the leap and see where it goes. So it was really just making sure that I had audience and engagement and I was getting paid for the content. And I was like, okay, now that I am, it's time to start to focus on this full time.
Yeah, that's great. It makes a lot of sense. And it's great that you were able to like monetize fairly early in like at least a reasonable enough way to be able to run with it and create that runway for yourself, like you said. I understand that like the content creation is just, one part of the picture for you. Like you wrote about this master plan on Substack, which I thought was
Hmm.
really interesting and like well thought out. And it's basically like there's kind of three prongs, which is like build a community, meet a bunch of founders, and then be able to invest in their startups. And obviously, with the theme being sort of hard tech space, all these things that you're producing the content
Optimism.
about. So
Hmm.
we'll love to kind of hear your like overview of that master plan and like how you think about it today, if it's at all different from like when you posted, and then just kind of like where you are in that journey. I know like you and I think both are still, at least we view ourselves as being like very early on whatever this journey is that we're on, but curious to just kind of hear your overview on it.
Yeah, I feel, and I hope that I've only accomplished like 1% of what I want to do. I do think I am totally at the beginning, and I'm still figuring out a lot. But the master plan has always been to, essentially I had seen all these creators making a ton of money, and I had known that angel investing existed and just VC and investing in general existed. And I was like, okay, why aren't these content creators investing their money instead of just like, spending on cars, which does get them more views for their later videos and everything. But I was thinking that, investing it in startups would actually be amazing, and then they could promote these startups. So I was like, okay, I should clearly do this. I think this is a unique idea, combining kind of content creation and startups or VC. And so the entire goal is to make enough money as a content creator, which can possibly have outsized returns compared to typical salaries, and then take all that money and invest it in these founders that are building really optimistic hard tech futuristic companies. And the way that I would phrase that is that the future Teslas, the future SpaceXs, which also, just by the nature of being SpaceX or Tesla, get a ton of media attention on their own as well. So you can kind of promote them, help them grow, help them hire, and everything like that.
So when you think about investing like today, like if you were in a position, I know we'll talk about sort of your ambitions in angel investing. And I know you like were able to write your first check, I heard, which is great. But if you like were like fully ramped right now and had like a big fund and were pretty aggressively investing, what's like the first and second order priorities for you in terms of investing, in terms of like categories?
Are you just saying like what category I would like to be investing in?
Yeah, like I guess on the one hand, it's like what would you like to be invested in, but on the other hand, like what do you think is actually coming soon and where you're seeing like the most momentum in terms of startups being
Mhm.
made that are, have a high potential for promise in the relative near term?
Yeah, so this is actually tricky because the content side of things is actually promoting startups that are kind of well known, or at least more known. The audience kind of has a grasp of it, and they're already kind of in the public eye. Maybe these EV SPACs and everything, like people want to talk about that. But then in the investing side, it's you want to be on the bleeding edge. You want to find these things that nobody else is talking about, that people don't really have a grasp on, and that you might have an informational edge on. So my first angel investment was in a quantum computing startup, Reactive Q, and I think like nobody's talking about it, but I think that they can simulate future materials such as superconductors, advanced semiconductors, biomaterials. There's a whole host of materials that they want to design, and I think that is like a category, quantum computing, that is now becoming usable in terms of it's not just a research project; it's more of a startup now. Then the second category, I think, that is gaining more hype, more people know about this one, is nuclear energy. There's a company that I'm looking at that is going to be, I think, is going to be really great in regards to nuclear. But yeah, so nuclear, quantum computing. I also think synthetic biology is going to really take off. It's definitely getting a lot of hype. Like there have been companies developing programmable genetics that have raised 300 million rounds. So that one's definitely raising a lot of money, but I'm very bullish on biotech in general. One for like enhancing humans. The main problem with that is FDA regulations, though. But maybe the pandemic has expedited all of these issues. So who knows? But yeah, I would say biotech, nuclear energy, and then quantum computing are my three picks for that question.
That's great. That's as good of a response as I could have hoped for. I think you mentioned at the end, like, improving humans, and when I hear that, I think of like first and foremost health span. I think that's the general field of like
Mhm.
longevity research and things like that is probably between the two of us where we have like the most overlap in the Venn diagram in terms of like the things that we've spent a lot of time digging into. And I think
Mhm.
that's a really exciting
Yeah, I
space.
should definitely add aging as the fourth one there.
Yeah, it's hard to know if it's going to be something that develops, for me at least, in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 and 30 plus or whatever. Especially because, like you said, like the FDA is somewhat of an immovable object in that category.
Mhm.
So we'll see, I guess. But would love to hear the story of this first angel investment you made, the one you mentioned in quantum computing. I understand like you met the founder through Twitter, and it's just very interesting to me. I'm seeing it happen myself a little bit now, where you can sort of put out this content and become somewhat of like a magnet for people working on things, you know,
Hmm.
very much related or even just tangentially related to sort of what you're talking about. And is that sort of how you were able to, meet and then eventually invest in this first company?
Hmm. Yeah. So, while you were asking that question, I thought of the fifth one, and that's terraforming, and that's using some biological methods. But yes. So, as for the angel investment, the way that I think about, you were talking about being a magnet for these people by just putting out the content. The way that I phrase this is that I think the internet is an AGI, artificial general intelligence, and that essentially by putting out content you're saying, hey, AGI, I am interested in this. And then the AGI, whether it takes days, weeks, months, will bring you back like the treasures that you're asking for. So I think that by asking the internet broadly on TikTok, but also, more of a niche community in Twitter, I think by just asking for amazing hard tech founders that are building an optimistic future, like I will just get those through putting out content. And so what ended up happening was I was um, just friends with like an investor, and we had been talking about this nanotech company. And then he put me in touch with Deep, who's building the quantum company. And we jumped on the phone. We immediately hit it off. I think we talked for like 2 hours. And then, we did just a few other phone calls. And this had been after I had become an accredited investor. And so I had essentially told the internet, I was like, hey, I can invest now. And so, we jumped on a few calls and I was like, okay, you have some edges here that are irrep, you know, irreplaceable. Not many people can actually use these edges, and I would love to invest. So that was essentially how that happened. It was through Twitter for sure.
So how did you go about becoming accredited? Because I know there's like some new pathways that I particularly am interested in to be able to take the series exam. Is that the route you went, or just qualifying by
Yeah, I
more
took the
traditional
Series
means?
65. I took the
Okay.
Series 65 exam. So the SEC changed their regulations so that you could take Series 7, Series 65, and Series 81 or 82, something like that. And I took the Series 65. So essentially, I can be a registered investment advisor. And that also qualifies me to be an accredited investor. I think it's tragic that the SEC has regulated all of these young investors to just the public markets. And this is probably why we're seeing a lot of frenzy over the hard tech SPACs. But yeah, I'm very glad that the SEC looks to be changing their regulations.
Yeah, that's really cool because that to me was like hopeful as well. I think it's somewhat unfortunate to your point that from like they frame, or at least historically they framed like accredited investor the designation as being sort of like to protect people who don't know enough from
Hmm.
making bad investments. But realistically, there's there's full classes of like amazing investments, including but not limited to early stage startups that are only available to people who are accredited, and it's somewhat unfair from my perspective to claim to be protecting people from like losing money in those things, but not giving them the opportunity to benefit from the upside. And then at the same time, there's no there's no
Hmm.
preventing people from like going to the casino and blowing all their money on blackjack
Or
or
getting a
like
margin trade on Robinhood. It's
exactly, yeah.
extremely paternalistic. And so I was actually talking with a friend about this, and he was saying like, I do think that the SEC or the accreditation market should be just free to everybody. But then he was saying, I also wish that Robinhood wouldn't give margin. And I was like, well, I think the only thing you can do is just describe the risks and rules and like just information, and then let everybody make their own decision. So I think that, if the private stage markets are more risky for a individual investor, I think they should just be told that and understand why it's more risky. And then, if the main reason it started is because people were lying about what they were actually investing in. And so as long as there's transparency in what you're investing in, I think people should be able to go for it.
I think the information is a good point. That's probably part of the nature of like why the accreditation doesn't really make sense anymore, is because like back when it first started, the information was somewhat limited. Like not everyone certainly could see all that was going on with all of these companies, but now the actual like SEC documents, are arguably not as valuable as just being able to like follow the founder and, see what he's talking about, and then see videos of people analyzing the company on YouTube and look at your TikToks and things like that. There's like so much information for everyone, and yet everyone can't invest. It's like
Hmm.
before, maybe the information was limited, so it made sense to sort of limit the investors to those who had access. But now it certainly seems that other people have at least the informational opportunity to get like just as smart as an accredited investor might be.
Absolutely. I mean, and Wall Street bets prove that recently that regular investors can be kind of smart. So, I mean, you could argue if they were actually smart, but some of them were in that subreddit.
Yeah, no, no doubt. Especially, the people who kind of started the wheel for sure.
Hmm.
And then some people obviously got burnt later on, which is somewhat unfortunate, but it is what it is. Risk,
That's just how it happens.
yeah, maybe you learn that way with $100 and then you don't lose, 100,000 later in life, or whatever it
Exactly.
is. But last thing on the investing, I guess, what's like your history with investing? Like, it's to your point, content creators, it hasn't been traditionally obvious for them to like turn their content platform into a vehicle for investing. So I'm
Hmm.
curious sort of how you came to that in the first place, if you had like a history investing in general, or investing in maybe some public opportunities for some of these hard tech stocks, or whatnot, space stocks, whatever it might have been, like Virgin and things like
Hmm.
that. So maybe just like your investing experience a little bit and how it translated into this, being a major part of the master plan.
Yeah, so I hadn't invested in any private companies before the quantum company and before I had really started doing any content creation. But I had in 2012 invested in, and I've been investing during an entire bull market. I started in 2012, so take this all with a grain of salt. But I had invested in Tesla and Netflix, each of those around $30 before any of their splits. So those had done pretty well, and I'd seen the power of investing and just massive returns over holding for nearly a decade. So I think that was just like super powerful in my mind as just an experience of just buy and hold something that you believe in, and returns will follow.
Yeah, Tesla at $30 will certainly spark the fire on an interest in investing, the way it's returned
For
over the
sure.
last several years, and especially in the last year or so.
Yeah.
But
But
when
then,
you
I
uh,
heard that I heard that Steve Jurvetson invested in Tesla at like $3 a share. And, he was actually told to sell some of his position when Tesla went public. But luckily he held. And, now without the split, maybe those $3 shares are worth $1,200 or something like that. Like it's absurd. So the lion's share of the gains really came after it went to the public markets. But
yeah,
and
and
and that's
that's
why with his new fund, he was telling investors and LPs that he's going to hold the value for. Sorry, he's going to have the fund return on like a 15-year timeline instead of a standard timeline.
Yeah, and that's not to like harp on it too much, but that's the other thing with this whole accredited split, is just the opportunity for growth that happens pre-IPO is so tremendous. You get Tesla at $3 if you're smart enough to sort of recognize it in the early days. And
Hmm.
even, I mean, Amazon, Tesla, there's no shortage of examples of companies that post-IPO, Facebook, post-IPO can, grow and give like serious returns, but there's still that earlier opportunity, which right now public investors just don't have the ability to participate in. So I'm hopeful in the
Hmm.
near term with companies like Carta, maybe AngelList, that will, maybe Republic is another one that maybe will have greater access for the public. But in the meantime, I think I got to follow your footsteps and take the series test and get that out of the way, because it's an awesome new pathway that they provided kind of quietly. And
Hmm.
without it, you couldn't be doing what you're doing, right?
For sure. No, without it, I would not be doing what I'm doing.
So
I would
let's
be
talk
up. Yeah.
about
Sorry. Go ahead.
no, no worries. Let's talk about another aspect of like the three-prong master plan that I mentioned earlier, sort of like community founders, startups, the community side, because like it's interesting. At no point in that master plan do you have, at least not in like the headline, do you have like content, but that's seemingly from like
Mm.
the outsider view what you're starting with. And I think I know why, but I'm curious to hear like how does, what's your approach to like building a community? I'm assuming it ties in with the content to some degree, but I'd love to hear how these things kind of interact in your mind.
Yeah, so I would say community is different than audience. Audience is kind of one-sided. Community means that they're also talking to me and I'm talking back to them. Audience is me just projecting to a lot of people. So I think having a community and really the main goal of a community is kind of to create like a pipeline of founders almost. So if you have somebody that's interested in your community and then you teach them about startups, similar to what YC did with Paul Graham essays, but also their YouTube videos, you teach them about startups and then they start thinking about these ideas and then they start riffing on ideas with you and then when they actually have their real big idea about the massive startup that they want to do, then you're probably the person that they'll come to. And so it's really fun creating a community where you can riff on ideas because the future is definitely not set in stone. Nobody has all the answers. It's not like these founders just materialize out of thin air. So yeah, just creating a community where you can kind of create an atmosphere of like uh, being able to promote ideas that you believe in, or like just riff on ideas, I think is the most important part, and your ideas won't get shut down.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I particularly like it's not a one-sided thing. A community, it's more of a two-sided exchange of ideas and communication, free flowing. The audience, I mean, one thing that I've come to appreciate just even early on is that it's as much or more about the quality as it is the quantity in terms of like followers and things like that. Just a
Mhm.
name on like the follow or a number on the follower account rather is actually like not so indicative of the connection that you have. So I think
Completely. And
that's
engagement. If you have 100,000 followers and your tweets get one like, I mean, come on, right?
yeah, no, totally. I've been kind of consciously all along thinking about like, I'm trying to focus on quality over quantity and not really worrying about like the accelerating follower count and things like that. And I see that like the influxes in followers for me come from like somewhat stupid things, like a tweet that goes viral that like actually
Mhm.
wasn't even in the top 30% of like the quality of tweets that I have, at least like in my own mind. And it's about like Bitcoin and GameStop, and suddenly I get a few hundred more followers. And it's just kind of like silly versus the people who actually like discover the podcast and like come to like binge on some stuff and then they're following me and that's like a real fan. Um,
Mhm.
so it's definitely an interesting thing to keep an eye on. I guess
It's a
how do you
balancing act.
yeah, exactly. How do you think about in terms of like platform and like caliber of follower or like opportunity to kind of engage with the followers like TikTok versus Twitter? I think you started more so on TikTok, certainly are bigger still on TikTok, but growing on Twitter as well. And like you said, we're able to source the deal there, or at least starting the seed there. I'm curious to hear sort of your compare and contrast of like the two platforms, pros and cons of each.
Yeah, so I would say that people looking to build startups should absolutely be on Twitter. This is the most important platform, and this is probably where a lot of the founder deal flow that I will have will come from. That's not to say, though, that TikTok is lower quality or anything like that. Like I've had people reach out to me, and they had a YC interview actually, and they were like, "Hey, can we can we jump on a phone and do a practice interview to practice for our interview with YC?" I was like, "Sure, sure. Like I'll talk to you guys." They had users throwing themselves at them. They had a great product. And so I had asked, like, okay, other than YC, what other investors have you spoken to? And they were like, what do you even mean? And so that's where I kind of realized that not everyone's on Twitter and that some of the VCs just aren't well known outside of Twitter, honestly, even to like high quality founders. So, but but more broadly, the way that I look at it is Twitter is where the engineers, the startup founders, the people really building the future are. And then TikTok is more of like a broad audience where I can just be enthusiastic about more broadly just science in the future and news that's happening and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think it's an interesting point you bring up where it's like people on TikTok or just generally off Twitter. There's sort of I've certainly realized over the last year there's this ecosystem that exists that say what you want about Twitter, good and bad. I think in some ways it's totally awesome and amazing, and in other
Mhm.
ways it's somewhat addicting and can certainly be negative in overdosing on it in a certain way and getting into the dopamine machine and things like that. But certainly a lot to be found. And I think a lot of people might just sort of see it as like a black and white. Like if I want to start a company and be a founder, I have to go and get into YC. But there's all of these. I mean, there's VCs and traditional angels, but now there's people like you who are coming up who are super interesting, super knowledgeable about different sectors and things like that, and can not only give people like money and advice to get their company going, but can also give them a platform to sort of get it out there amongst your followers and things like that. So it's
Yeah,
like,
help them hire, help them if they have a consumer product. Like even if they don't have a consumer product, it still helps to get their name out there. Yeah, so I totally agree that it's useful to have like the niche audience and the broad audience. So the way that I look at it is like it's almost an arbitrage. Like Twitter, I can show Twitter like that I have an arbitrage to a broader audience or something like that.
yeah, it's 100%. I think there's a lot that you can do just with the number of eyeballs you have, and again, not just the number, but like the engagement of those people.
Mhm.
There's a lot more to offer a founder than maybe a traditional angel who has really good advice and has the money, but all money, the money itself is the same, and the advice might be better or worse, but you bring a
Mhm.
third factor with the viral mechanism basically, and the ability for not just consumer businesses like you said, but really any business. Like good PR is good PR. Some
Yep.
people say any PR is good PR, but the ability for you to get these founders out in the open, and especially because all of the people interested in this space are coming to you, they might find their next big investor from your platform or whatever it is. So it's really interesting. Let's um let's go through like your evolution on TikTok again. I'm no TikTok expert by any means, but I scrolled all the way back and it took a while because you've been a prolific content creator up there. But I got all the
I
way back to the
try.
beginning. Yeah, and you started and it looked like maybe it took you 6 or 7 videos to figure out that like space was the thing. Like you mentioned, there was I think like your first video got like 250,000 views or so, and it was
Mhm.
sort of the rundown of Elon Musk and SpaceX, some announcement that they made at the time. But before that, you were doing like sort of random videos. There was one you were like eating a stick of butter. I was like, this is the content that I came for.
Yeah,
Um,
just like doing a trend thing or something. I was just messing around and having fun for
and
sure.
but quickly, like you found that like, okay, this SpaceX thing went off, so I'm gonna start doing a lot of space videos. And now it seems like you've kind of gotten in the groove of doing like weekly space updates and weekly hard tech updates as well. Um, would love to hear like, and also like the production value I see has gone up like a lot. Like you're doing a lot different things. You have like the whole background set to certain images, and you're doing like slides and pointing to things and like covering things with your head and things like that. Whereas at the
Mhm.
beginning it was kind of a little more, something that it looked like wasn't maybe quite as difficult, and you've learned a lot since then. So we'll just be curious to hear like the ins and outs of TikTok over your journey.
Yeah, I would actually credit a lot of that to just TikTok building out a really great video editing platform. And I don't think it's perfect by any means. I think there's a lot of improvements they can make, but it's mainly, and this has been discussed a lot within the TikTok conversation, but it's just so easy to create content there. So originally, I was just using the TikTok editor to record my screen, and I would pull up images and just record my screen. But now they have like the green screen effects and then all these other effects. And then I have downloaded like an editor so I can edit movies kind of like slides and stuff, but that takes a lot of work. So I only do that for specific videos, to be honest. But then I just go back to the green screen and pretty easily make videos. So I would credit a lot of that to just TikTok's evolution as a platform. I mean, I started in 2019, which was when they were still developing these tools. So I've been fortunate to like capitalize on their developments.
Yeah, it's interesting, like getting involved early with a platform and then being able to grow alongside it and experience the improvement of tools. I'm curious, are you dabbling with Clubhouse at all right now, and getting involved in the early days of that?
Um, I don't dabble with Clubhouse. I'm focused on audio right now with the podcast, but uh, personally, I prefer having evergreen content so that people can kind of go through a backlog, and I prefer more produced things. Maybe NYU Girls Shoot Your Shot is pretty fun, but personally, I just don't get too much value out of that. And even out of the space conversations, like they're all right. I just haven't really learned a ton. Maybe that's on me as a user. I think that the Elon Musk Vlad interview was amazing because there's no platform that could have happened on otherwise. And then, the Steve Jobs interview or Steve Jobs stories the other night was pretty fun too. But I think Clubhouse is interesting. I'm actually I'm also pushing TikTok for a lot more features. Um, but yeah, I think Clubhouse is interesting.
Yeah, I'm sort of with you. I think for me, there's tremendous value in being able to record everything that I've done in terms of like the podcast. Like right now, recording with you, like so many people will be able to listen to this versus if we had done it on Clubhouse. At least, I mean, maybe you could have brought the people, but I certainly wouldn't have brought in like too many people. And versus this, where there's people who listen to the podcast today, obviously, and over the next week or two or whatever it is. But then in the long term, as people continue to sort of discover both of us, really, they can go in their podcasts and search. They're either on my podcast or they search your name, and they can listen to this in 5 years. And it's just, to
Hmm.
me, Clubhouse, you might be capturing like 1% of the listeners you otherwise could have in a recorded version. And I think there's interesting use cases for Clubhouse. Like I think it's pretty good for like nuanced debate, because on here there's
Hmm.
like tends to be like a host and a guest, and on there it can kind of be more of an even split. um with like less of that sort of dynamic of like being on a show or hosting a show or whatever it is. But I, like you, I'm like, on the one hand, maybe I just haven't spent enough time, but on the other hand, not too sure I want to like invest much early in terms of like my time and energy. But
Exactly.
you were able to see that with TikTok early on, that it was a valuable place for you to kind of invest, right?
I think Clubhouse will develop these features. So I think that they'll probably have a feature where you can record the podcast and or the episode or the conversation, and then it will automatically turn into a podcast. I wouldn't be surprised if they do that and help their creators monetize, because if you can't monetize on a platform, um, it's kind of useless for creators. Like, well, they are kind of incentivized maybe, but it just will really help their platform, and I'm sure that they're working on that
Social media is exciting, but what's more exciting, I think, is space. So
for sure.
let's go there. I think I mean I don't have like a great understanding, like I've said, on space. Like I'm sort of getting up to speed a little bit. My understanding from far out is that everything SpaceX is doing, and maybe some other companies as well, in terms of driving down launch costs rapidly, is sort of serving as a catalyst for the entire industry.
Mhm.
And that, it might enable things such as like space manufacturing and whatnot. I had Delian on from Varda Space, which I think sounds like an awesome company.
Varda's
Cu-
amazing.
yeah, curious to hear, and maybe you could talk about Varda a little bit. And I saw you had it as part of your one of your weekly space updates. So I figure you know a thing or two, at least. But would love to hear sort of your overall, for the average listener who actually doesn't really know what's really going on in space. Obviously, they can go down the rabbit hole on your TikTok, but would love to hear sort of the shorter synopsis of what's going on and what there is to be excited about.
Yeah, I can't talk about the details of Varda, but they're just doing in space manufacturing. And I think the main value of space is that it's the next infinite frontier. That's just how I would think about it. SpaceX is building the transportation so that you can get from point A to point B. They're building the highway system, and then you gotta look at who's going to build the hotel system, the gas stations, the mining, the off-world industries. I think those are going to be the big industries, and just like conceptualizing space as the infinite frontier, I think is a really good paradigm to look at it at.
And you've talked a lot about Mars. Like I watched this one video where you were explaining why a TikTok rather, where you were explaining why like it's actually pretty unlikely that we would live in domes on Mars, even though like a lot of people are conceptually
Oh, for sure.
imaging
Domes don't
domes.
make any sense.
Yeah,
Artist renderings don't make sense. So anybody listening to this should go listen to Casey or read Casey Handmer's blog on why domes don't make sense. He lays out the case, but essentially domes are pressurized, right? And so if you have one atmospheric pressure, of Earth's atmospheric pressure, and then outside of the dome you have Mars atmospheric pressure, which is significantly less. I think it's like 1%, 6%, something like that of Earth's atmosphere. Um, then you actually have this upward force kind of pushing out. So it's a pressurized thing on the Martian surface, and so you have to anchor it to the ground. So you can anchor it to the ground around the outside of the circle if it's a dome, right? But then you're spending a lot of force, or you're spending a lot of effort to anchor this to the ground, and you have another problem, which is that if you actually want your society to grow, it's pretty hard to connect these domes together and create a bunch of domes. Domes are just terrible to work with in general, even just on Earth construction. So you have this force pushing upward, and then you just can't expand. So what seems to make the most sense is that if you kind of look at um, a bunch of columns pulling like that, a bunch of columns that can a bunch of columns that can help with the pressurized force pushing upwards. So you have a bunch of columns, and then it turns into like this rectangular structure. And the best way to phrase it is like it's a gigafactory. And so you can build maybe this. Uh, I don't know, like you can build this small gigafactory, and then you just add a few columns outside, you add a roof over that, and then you expand the gigafactory. And so what you end up with is this more elegant expanding structure. And so it's like an ever expanding gigafactory across the Martian surface where you can just keep creating more habitat as needed. I think that's a super important way to look at it, because then we're not feeling like we're living in domes. We're not feeling like we're gonna just be surviving on crickets. We're like building and then expanding and into the frontier.
Yeah, I think that that made sense just from your explanation just now. And also, there might be a longer blog post that explains it in more detail. But for people like me, the TikTok was sufficient to sort of get the picture. And I'm anti domes now. I'm pro this
Yeah, once
gigafactory
you
look.
once you notice it, like I get people tagging me in concept art that's like Nasjaq wouldn't like this with the domes.
Yeah, we're anti-domes on this podcast. We like the small, expandable gigafactory look, and I think just
Absolutely.
like building more modularly, I'm actually hopeful for that sort of thing on Earth as well. It's a little bit of a different story, but being able to just improve construction and architecture and the way that we sort of think about how we live and the structures that we live in is an interesting thread to go down. But Mars specifically, like, what are your hopes and expectations? Obviously, we're both young guys. Like, I think we both share this tremendous optimism for what's possible over the
Mhm.
course of our lifetimes, which I think we both hope also, and maybe optimistic, could be a lot longer than a traditional lifetime has been, and a
Yes.
lot healthier as well. What are your what's your like near-ish term outlook for Mars, and how that's there's obviously could be some development of like space manufacturing and things. Mars is like a bit of a at least a different category. Maybe it's related and whatnot, but I'm curious, like Mars specifically, what your thoughts are for the future.
Yeah, so I mean, I think SpaceX is the answer here, the Starship architecture. I think they will get humans on Mars by the end of the decade. I don't know if it'll be one human or how long that human will last, but I do think they will have humans on Mars by the end of the decade, and then hopefully a few thousand humans by the end of 20, or at least halfway through that decade, 2035. It really depends on the Mars planetary trajectories too. So on how quickly we can populate and how many starships they have, but the rate that they're manufacturing starships will exponentially increase, and we're going to have a ton of humans on Mars. So my main prediction there is humans on Mars by end of the decade.
That's awesome. And it's just like so crazy to think about. I don't spend a lot of time, like I said, in this specific sector. I want to spend more because it's just, I mean, I'm doing this podcast a lot talking about, optimistic futures that, resulting from technology. And I just haven't gone down the space rabbit hole. I think it's a little from the outside looking in, it's so technical, but,
Have you found anything that really piqued your curiosity?
Not enough to like really dig in. Not that it's like not interesting to me. It's just hard to explain. Like I think I go down things when I think that I might be able to, make an impact, or there's just like a certain set of drivers that would lead me to like totally binge on content. And your TikTok is the closest thing. Maybe this podcast will sort of lead me down the rabbit hole. Similar to like aging, like not something that was obvious for me to become interested by any means, but that was just like so big from my perspective. I mean, space is infinite, so I guess it's
Mhm.
they're both quite large, but these things that are just like endless potential and receiving not so much attention, space maybe more so than aging, but the prospects of like literally having humans on Mars in the next 10 years is is pretty incredible. And I think your content specifically, everything you're doing, and hopefully it'll reflect. I'm certainly optimistic that it'll reflect in sort of like the investment portfolio you're able to build over the next decade. Should age quite nicely since you're digging in on all this stuff kind of a
I sure
decade
hope so.
in front of legit progress.
Yeah, yeah. The main thing I think is that people in our media environment's fairly pessimistic because that drives a lot of clicks. And so I think people are just not seeing optimism. And so just by making these videos, it makes it feel like the future's actually happening um, every day. Like things are actually progressing.
Yeah, I think it's a large part of it. I guess that's maybe a good place to go for my last question, and then we'll tell people where to follow you and things like that. But what do you think? Could you just kind of elaborate a bit more on the importance of having this content and this general narrative about the possibility of technology in the near term and the long term to make for a better world for individuals as well as collectively, and how sort of imagination helps sort of drive the reality in a way, and you need to kind of have that content before you can have the actual people building and the success come to fruition.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to how you need concept art before you actually you need concept art of the 7 minutes of terror and landing the Perseverance rover before you can actually land the Perseverance rover, right? So you need the people that are kind of imagining the future. And the way that I think about my content is that it's not necessarily like one piece of content that will define the future or change the future, but it's the threads throughout all of the content that I produce. And you can kind of relate this maybe to someone like Tim Ferriss. Like you won't remember Tim Ferriss episode number 300, 70 or something, but you will remember that Tim Ferriss is very focused on self-optimization, maybe Jordan Peterson, like self-responsibility type things, or um, biohacking. All of these threads are very like common within his narratives, and then people start biohacking and doing more self-optimization, and he's or doing more 4 hour work weeks and optimizing their time and stuff like this. And so then if I kind of have threads throughout my work that are like building an optimistic future, creating advanced like or impossible materials like superconductors, room temperature superconductors, or terraforming the Salton Sea, and you like associate those ideas with maybe Nasjaq, but also just being possible, as in like there's ways to attack this. I think that's kind of how those ideas start disseminating into society, and then regardless of if it's attached to my name or not, people will just start maybe working more on terraforming using maybe biological methods or something like that. And so that's kind of how I think about just all of the content that I produce. It's like the specifics of each video and each piece of content do help, like having domes on Mars, but just but just like the overall thread of hopefully getting more engineers working on these awesome problems is the thing that I really want.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's a great perspective, and I'm excited about everything that you're producing content on it. And I think it's an interesting point you make, that it's like you make all this very detailed content, but then at the end of the day, it's just sort of to bring attention to this broader thread of like, all right, space is going to be awesome, this hard tech is possible, and a better future is coming. And that's sort of like, if people can just take, and maybe those aren't the exact threads, but if people can take
Mhm.
like a few broad things away from just doing consistent work and like going deep, and it's a lot of work for sort of a single or a few like broad takeaways, like even Tim Ferriss, like you said. But
Mhm.
I think it's possible as you and I to make like a real impact in this way. And obviously you have some of the more of the technical expertise for sure, but even as me, like without the technical expertise, I find that I'm able to help bring some attention to some of these things that I think are really important. And it's an amazing aspect of the internet age. Um, well, I'm glad that we were able to do this today. I'm glad that the internet, the AGI, as you mentioned, was able to
Yes, brought us together.
yeah, brought us together. And I think, like you said, and like I said earlier, I think we're both viewing ourselves and each other as extremely early on in the growth,
Frighteningly early.
frighteningly early. That's what I'm going with from now
We
on.
have a
That is,
massive mountain to climb.
yeah,
We have
1%.
maybe put on our shoes.
Exactly. Yeah,
Like,
I'm just
oh
putting
my
on my second
God.
sock. I think you maybe have
Yeah.
your first shoe on or something like that. but it's really cool. I'm excited about the Nasjaq master plan. I'm excited about the investments you're going to make, and looking forward to keeping in touch. Where can people go? And I mean, TikTok first and foremost, Twitter, anywhere you want to drive people. The new podcast, highly encourage people to go listen to that. Just tell people where they can go and get into this Nasjaq community, which is only going to go up from here.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, my favorite place to meet people and talk to people is definitely Twitter. My username is Nasjaq underscore underscore because for some reason Nasjaq was taken and I think I messed up the old Nasjaq underscore account. But Nasjaq underscore underscore on Twitter. And then my master plan is nasjaq.substack.com. That's kind of just like my Patreon to generally support the work. But of course, the TikTok. And now I'm starting this podcast. Currently, the name is Nasjaq Futurism with a V, so FVTRISM. And my thinking there is like future FVTR is like the ticker symbol for the future. So Nasdaq Futurism, where I interview people, engineers, researchers, founders building hard tech future. That's definitely what I want to focus on. I want to kind of be like the technical Joe Rogan or the hard tech Lex Friedman if Lex Friedman focuses on software. So that's my main focus right now. I think that through those podcast episodes, I can create those threads, those narratives of an optimistic future. And that's really what I'm working on.